Uhuru.
Uhuru. Brother,
All power to the people.
power to the people.
Thank you so much, Reverend Pickney. Inspiration for me, a true freedom fighter who puts it on the line. When the rulers attempt to try to intimidate us, there's some folks that can't be intimidated. And our dear brother is one of them. And he has paid a price as the consequence. So it's a pleasure to be introduced by Reverend Pickney. It's a pleasure to be part of this gathering with all of these freedom fighters that we have in this coalition, and all of the people who got up this early Sunday morning to sign up and to come into this very, very important, indeed, perhaps historic conversation. Let me also too thank our dear leader, our brother chairman, for so many things, including in his intro this morning, taking a big piece of my presentation. So I have to scramble a little bit in this presentation because, of course, what the chairman did was to provide a historical framework. You know, you can't talk about the African petty bourgeoisie. You can't talk about the structure of the African class structure without having that placed into some kind of historical context. So I want to talk about that and move that to our discussion of the contemporary political scene and the electoral process and how we relate to it, have related to it in the past. You know, I start by saying, basically, it's important for us to understand that, as Cabral reminded us, without revolutionary theory, there could be no revolution. We have to have a basic understanding of the objective conditions that face our people in order for us to transform those conditions. Now, that's important too, because, you know, in this contemporary period, we find a lot of idealism. That instead of us applying a materialist framework and understanding for what is unfolding, particularly when it comes to policies being articulated by the ruling elements, we see that there's a lot of analysis based on psychology, attempts to try to read the psychology of a Trump or a Biden or whoever, as opposed to looking at the objective class forces that they represent and how those class forces are connected to the structure of this economy and the politics that they are in fact advancing. So when we take a look at the role of the African petty bourgeoisie, we have to take a look at that history in terms of how that class has evolved and what kinds of changes have taken place. And how those changes that took place are related to the politics of this settler colonial project in the United States of America. You know, one place we started, and Chairman O'Malley touched on it, for me at least too also, is that, you know, you can't understand the contemporary politics in the African petty bourgeoisie without going back at least to the 1970s. And the 1970s are important because this was the period in which the state intensified its counterinsurgency, its counter-revolutionary targeting of our movement. And the state had two basic objectives. Basically, it was to militarily defeat the Black liberation movement, but they had an ideological objective too. And that was basically to make the African into an American. And that is in some ways even more devastating than the military defeat of our movement, because, you know, our ability to defend ourselves and to advance our interests, you know, we're gonna advance that, we're gonna develop that, we're gonna strengthen that. But it makes it more difficult to do that when we have to deal with the subjective element. The fact that today we have to deal with the fact that so many of our people have lost that critical perspective, have identified to an extent with the American, so-called American project. And that process, as I said, really intensified in the 1970s. And part of what they did to make the African an American was expand the ranks of the petty bourgeoisie through state employment and the incorporation of this element into the corporations. The first CEO, the first whatever in these corporations. And what happened was a transformation of that class, because traditionally we know that the Black petty bourgeoisie, as well as the bourgeoisie, was always organically connected to our people, to our community. That's how they survived. That was the material basis of their existence. The Black bourgeois business person was dependent on the Black market that we provided. The Black petty bourgeoisie was dependent on us. Like many of you all, I grew up with when we could go to a doctor, we went to a Black doctor. We had a Black dentist. In our schools on the south side of Chicago, the colony of the south side of Chicago, 90%, really 95% of our teachers were African, okay? So there was that organic connection between that class and us. But as a consequence of those differences, those changes in the 1970s, what we see was that there was a disconnection, a psychological, a political, and ideological, and even a physical separation between those classes and the rest of our folks. And it had a profound impact. It was a contradictory process too, because as that class was disconnecting psychologically and politically, at the same time though, they had a material basis for advancing themselves through their participation in the electoral process. By running themselves as the mayors and members of the city council and county commissions, they created for themselves a material base for them to continue the process of advancing their class interests. We remember that when they took over these various cities during that decade and into the 80s to a certain extent, they were able to do things like these set-asides, where they would devote a certain amount of their budgets, city budgets, to the aspirations of these Black business people. People like Herman Russell in Atlanta, who became a multi-million dollars as a consequence of that process. And that took place across the country, okay? So this was the differences that were taking place, this process of making the African an American, giving the African at least the petty bourgeoisie, a material stake in this system. And this is what we have to deal with. You take a look at our politics and look at 1968, when Dr. King was assassinated. What was he doing? He was in Memphis. He was fighting with Black sanitation workers, trying to win dignity for those workers, okay, who went out on strike for their dignity. You then compare that to 1973, after they murdered Dr. King and after the full assault on our movement was taking place. 1973, in Atlanta, Georgia, you had the first Black mayor, Maynard Jackson, who came to power. What was the first thing that Maynard Jackson did in 1973? The Black sanitation workers said, well, we got a Black mayor now and we helped put him in place. Now we want to have an increase in benefits and salaries. And so let's make this demand to this Black mayor to address our material needs after we help put him in office. And what did Maynard Jackson do? He attacked the union and just about broke it. But here you have us mobilizing to protect union rights in Memphis in 1968 against a white administration. And just 5 years later, 1973, this Black administration attacks and destroys Black sanitation workers. Class is important that we recognize that, because this class is a class that has consciousness of itself, of its interests, and is all out for itself. So this process of the Americanization of the African really had its culmination, if you will, in my opinion, with the election of Barack Hussein, and many of us say insane, Obama. Basically, this was the process of our people having a psychological and emotional investment in this settler colonial project. And it's been a devastating consequence as a result. But this process is a historical process, as we said. This class, this petty bourgeois and bourgeois class, we saw it got behind Bill Clinton in the 1990s. It gave its support to the policies of the Bill Clinton administration as it dismantled the New Deal programs, the attack on welfare as we knew it, the crime bill, the creation of the militarization of the border in preparation for NAFTA, and the aggressive expansion of the neoliberal project. They gave their support to Clinton, and then, of course, to the Obama administration. They saw their interests tied up with the candidacies of Elizabeth Warren, and now with Joe Biden. This class is clear about its particular interests. And so we have to be clear about our particular interests as we organize ourselves and participate in this electoral process. So we participate in it, but we understand that we do it strategically. We're not confused about the possibilities of this electoral arena. In fact, we understand its real limitations, and we see those limitations being played out every day. We saw what happened with the soft social democracy of Bernard Sanders and his capitulation to the DNC. We saw the fact, and we see the fact that there's been no real commitment on the part of the DNC to win progressives offices on the local and state levels. So we go into this arena, but we go into this arena with consciousness. We understand its limitations, but we see that it is a place where millions of our people participate, and therefore we have to be there to contest in that arena. So my brothers and sisters, we have a lot of work to do. That basically, if we're going to participate in this electoral arena, we have to do it consciously. We have to do it in an organized fashion. And that's really and is part of what we've been trying to do with the Black is Back Coalition and these electoral schools, to bring people together so that we can look at how we address this electoral arena, to what degree we can advance a revolutionary project, where we can understand how we can get access to our people in order to raise the consciousness of our people, to understand how this electoral process might be able to facilitate us building alternative movements. So we see this basically as an arena to be contested, and an arena that allows us to move ourselves toward our ultimate objectives. We don't see the electoral process as an end in itself. You see it as just a convenient instrument, an arena that helps us to build alternative power. We understand the protracted nature of this fight that we're in. And so our participation in this arena has to be seen as part of that process of building independent, alternative, revolutionary structures. That's our objective, to get access to the people, to raise the awareness of our people, to strengthen our organizations and our institutions for the ultimate fight that we have to engage in. Because we are involved in a fight. We are engaged in a war. And we have to make sure that this war does not continue to be a one-sided war. So this is part of our building our capacity to resist, building our capacity to be victorious. Because it's not just having a correct analysis, my friends. It's also being able to project a vision and understanding of where we need to go. And that understanding is coming because this process of this pandemic has really exposed the true nature of the system. People are becoming radicalized, if you will. Right. the power of the capitalist dictatorship has been able to be advanced because of its ability to conceal the fact that it is, in fact, a capitalist dictatorship. But the way in which they've been moving these last few weeks has really revealed for millions of people the fact that their interests and the interests of the people are antagonistic and contradictory. And that process is what we need to be building on as we access and deal with this electoral arena. So as I close, let me just say this. We know that the African petty bourgeoisie may be one of the most corrupt classes on the planet. And we remember that our dear revolutionary theorist, Amilcar Cabral, also talked about the absolute necessity for the petty bourgeoisie to commit what he calls class suicide. But we have to be very careful. We cannot have any romantic illusions about any of this. Again, we have to be grounded materially. And if we attempt to project into the contemporary moment that call for the petty bourgeoisie in this context, at this moment, to commit class suicide, and for us to spend an inordinate amount of time trying to win that element over to a revolution, that is a mistake. That basically, as we said, this element has its own objective class interests, and they are more than willing to advance those class interests. Plus, to spend time trying to win that element over to revolution is a betrayal. It diverts us from the real energy that we have to have in terms of building the base among the African working class here in this country, and really globally. So we say there can be no class suicide, that basically that element, that African petty bourgeoisie, if they align themselves with the power of the bourgeoisie, if they associate and see themselves as part of that process, if they align themselves with the enemy, then for us, we have to say they are the enemy and deal with them accordingly. Uhuru.